not today's political adventure. I yield.
Good morning. I want to thank Chairman Grassley for convening this hearing and my colleague, Senator Schmidt from Missouri, for co-chairing this with me as we examine the constitutional crisis posed by the cover-up of President Biden's cognitive decline. The U.S. Constitution provides, as we all know, for three co-equal branches. Today, we're concerned about the chief executive, the President of the United States. As we know, the chief executive, the head of the executive branch, enforces the laws, appoints high-ranking officials, serves as commander-in-chief of our armed forces, can issue pardons, and can veto and advocate for legislation. But what are we to do when the president is incapable of performing these duties? Last June, the American public saw with their own eyes what many knew to be true, but would not dare to admit publicly. Our sitting commander-in-chief was suffering from severe cognitive decline, as evident by this video, which I will now show.
For what I've been able to do with the with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare, wants to get rid of the ability of Medicare for us to be able to negotiate.
As we now know, there was a conspiracy to hide the president's true condition by his family, by his staff, by the media, and many elected officials. Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson, who co-authored a book entitled Original Sin, that book amounted to a mea culpa by the mainstream media, but they summed up the problem when they wrote this. Quote, "What the world saw at Joe Biden's one and only 2024 debate was not an anomaly. It was not a cold. It was not someone who was under or over prepared. It was not someone who was just a little tired. It was the natural result of an 81-year-old man whose capabilities had been diminishing for years. Biden, his family, and his team let their self-interest and their fear of another Trump term justify an attempt to put an at times addled old man in the Oval Office for 4 more years. So make no mistake about it, this was a constitutional crisis, bigger than President Biden, bigger than any single election, and one that cannot be absolved by the collective apology of the press and an election where the president's party lost. Current events, such as we are experiencing today in the Middle East, are a prime example of why we need a president with his full cognitive abilities, making important decisions involving war and peace. We should know, but we don't yet know, precisely what should happen when a president is unable to perform his or her constitutional duties. And that's the purpose of today's hearing. There are many unanswered questions from this scandal, questions that the authors of Original Sin failed to address in their book, questions that are foundational to the proper functioning of our government. We will address those here and shine a light on exactly what went on in the White House during the Biden presidency. We simply cannot ignore what transpired because President Biden is no longer in office. With a compromised president, our government's very legitimacy and capacity to function was undermined. The American people paid a price, from President Biden's handling of the border crisis to the disastrous events we saw unfold in Afghanistan. It's absolutely imperative that Congress grapple with these difficult questions, no matter how much our Democratic colleagues would like to simply sweep it under the rug. We need to know who was in charge during the last months of the Biden administration. Was it his wife, his chief of staff, nameless others? None of these people were elected by the American people, nor were they authorized by the Constitution and laws of the United States to carry out the duties of the President of the United States. The 25th Amendment provides a roadmap for succession in instances of presidential incapacity. Section 4 gives the Vice President and a majority of the President's cabinet the authority to challenge the President's ability to carry out the functions of his office, subject to a vote in Congress. But in this instance, the Vice President and the cabinet, the very ones authorized by the 25th Amendment to question the President's capacity, they did nothing. Are there penalties when the when the cabinet and the Vice President refuse to carry out their duties under Section 4 of the 25th Amendment? Should there be more accountability? The framers of this amendment acknowledged that the execution of that amendment would depend on the good faith of the cabinet and the Vice President. But Biden's cabinet and the Vice President did not act in good faith. They acted in their political and personal self-interest. This is the great paradox of self-government. Many of the rules, traditions, and institutions that sustain our republic are self-enforcing. The health and legitimacy of our democratic republic rests on the character of the men and women who serve in government. As a government, it is imperative that we have clear contingency plans when emergency strikes. And yes, it is an emergency when we have a sitting president who's unable to discharge the duties of that office. The concerns raised by this incident stretch far beyond the bounds of partisan politics. I will note that few of my Democratic colleagues are here today. Thank you to Senator Welch from Vermont for being here, leaving us with no other option than to take the boycotting of this hearing as an admission of guilt for their role in this crisis. We must not turn away from the search for answers, and it is not an overstatement to say that the future of our country could one day hinge on how we choose to act or not act on this very issue. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses this morning as we examine the difficult but necessary questions that must be answered from this monumental scandal. I yield to my colleague from Missouri, Senator Schmidt, who will now co-chair the hearing.